You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome, listeners, to another episode of People, Places, Planet. Forever chemicals are everywhere, and the regulations to rein them in are finally catching up. Today, we're breaking down PFAS, what they are, why they've triggered one of the biggest waves of environmental action in decades, and why states aren't waiting for the federal government to take the lead. Whether you're an expert in toxic substances or a concerned parent, this episode is for you. Joining me today are three guests from the New Mexico Environment Department. Secretary Jim Kenney, who listeners will recognize from our ECOS episode, brings over 2 decades of experience in environmental enforcement and policy, including prior service at the EPA. He's joined by the department's General Counsel, Zachary Ogaz, and Assistant General Counsel, Greg Smithkier. Zach and Greg, before we dive in, why don't you each give our listeners a quick introduction?
My name is Greg Smithkier. I'm Assistant General Counsel for the New Mexico Environment Department. I was hired in a role at the department to only work on PFAS-related matters, and with the department for a little under 2 years now.
Yeah, my name is Zach Ogaz. I'm the General Counsel at the New Mexico Environment Department. I was previously at the New Mexico Attorney General's office, where I specialize in water, natural resources, and other environmental issues.
Well, welcome all to the episode. It's great to have you here today. Thank you for taking the time out of the busy schedule that I'm sure you're keeping here this week in DC. So maybe we can start at the basics, right? What are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are also known as PFAS, and why are they oftentimes referred to as forever chemicals?
Sure. So PFAS are a group of man-made chemicals. They have been around since the 1940s. An interesting connection with New Mexico, PFAS were utilized during the Manhattan Project, and the chemistry around them was developed during that time. New Mexico has a statutory definition of PFAS, which is a group of compounds that have one fully fluorinated carbon atom.
Yeah, and Sebastian, I think while we have this legal definition of PFAS and we have this interesting connection to PFAS in New Mexico, these chemicals are so ubiquitous in everything from consumer products to all sorts of things that we find in our everyday lives, whether that's pharmaceutical products or even in pesticides that are on our produce, or whether they're in your carpet tiles or in the paint in your home. PFAS are just everywhere throughout our lives and our economy.
PFAS are often referred to as forever chemicals because they're persistent, meaning it takes a long time for them to break down. They remain in the environment for a long period of time. They remain in human tissue for a long period of time. So, they don't break down. They stay in your system. They stay in the ecosystem. And that's why they're referred to as forever chemicals. But, 2 other monikers that are associated with PFAS are they are mobile and they are also bioaccumulative. Mobile meaning they move through the soils and through water very easily, and bioaccumulative meaning that they work their way up through the food chain. And for example, if there was a lake or a pond with PFAS in the water and a fish was living in that water, that fish may then absorb some of that PFAS in the water. And if a fisherman were to come along and pull that fish out of the water and cook and eat that fish, PFAS molecules that were in the fish would then be transferred and absorbed by that fisherman. So it will move up the food chain and continue to spread.
And just to be clear, what are some of the threats that forever chemicals pose to human health if they make it into the body?
There's a number of medical issues associated with the PFAS that we're learning. That there's still only about 2 decades worth of medical research on PFAS, but you have issues like liver conditions, kidney conditions. It could cause birth defects. It could cause issues with childhood development and other types of pregnancy and childhood development issues, as well as cancers as well.
Well, and I think the framing around PFAS, we've been trying to think of different ways to explain this to individuals who may be concerned about it. And when you think about, you may be somebody who's trying to start a family. And if you're in that situation, there could be fertility issues with both men and women. Let's say you do successfully start a family. Now, a mother may pass PFAS to their child through breastfeeding, but that mother may also have complications in pregnancy with things like high blood pressure, preeclampsia. And then as you move through life, as we know with these PFAS chemicals bioaccumulating, you're just exposed and receive additional dosage of that, which leads to some of the issues of high cholesterol or certain types of organ compromise that include things like cancers many of us read about.
Zach and Jim, you both mentioned the kind of importance of the bioaccumulation to the threat that PFAS poses. And from the state perspective, where are you seeing PFAS showing up in the environment? And why is that particularly alarming for a state like New Mexico?
PFAS are showing up all over in the environment. What we're finding is we're finding them in the air, we're finding them in the groundwater, we're finding them in oils. Specifically in New Mexico, we're finding them near Air Force bases and airports, being found in landfills, they're being found at wastewater treatment plants, and they're also being found in homes. We're finding, for example, there's PFAS products in waterproof clothing and Scotchgard, any type of furniture protector. So that's also a really big concern because a lot of times folks put furniture protector on their furniture, on their carpet, something like that. And they have no idea that when they go to sit down, when their children are running over that carpet, playing on that carpet, those products are really actually hazardous and toxic for them. And, Secretary Kenney has told us a story about he went looking for these types of furniture protector products. And I'll let you tell the story, but they had told Secretary Kenney that this product that could be used to protect a piece of furniture was totally harmless, dries in an hour, you can sit right down, and you'll never have a problem with it again. But I'll let you go ahead and tell that story.
Yeah, so going into a big box retailer that would probably be in not just New Mexico, but in every state in the country was offering a fabric protection service to the customers. And when inquired about what is in the fabric protector, as the bottle stated, it was non-toxic, non-hazardous, safe to use around pets and family, and everything that you would read would lead you to believe that there's no concerns about that fabric protector. And even the retail staff said the same thing. Come to find out that that fabric protector contained 50 times the concentration of PFAS that the Safe Drinking Water Act says would be safe for you to consume. So we're not going to consume that bottle of fabric protector. But at the same time, that bottle of fabric protector, when you're finished with it, what do you do with it? So it's on your furniture, it's drying there. You may have your family using that furniture, but then you're throwing that bottle or rinsing that bottle out, throwing it in the trash. So you're moving PFAS through the economy. What's really interesting about that is that the PFAS that was in that one specific fabric protector had not been manufactured in the United States since 1999. So there's significant quantities of PFAS still in the economy in the US, still being compounded and sold. And we as consumers don't really understand, especially when you have a misleading label, what the possible health implications are from that bottle.
I think, at least for our listeners who are maybe not too familiar with PFAS and maybe a little bit more familiar with the concepts of like plastics, microplastic shedding, right? Obviously, they're different substances, but I think conceptually the idea of how it moves through your house can be kind of similar, right? Like you're not purposefully buying PFAS, right? But you're buying things that have PFAS on them. And whether it's a pan, as we talked about, that is like then shedding that into your home.
You're eating it, you're ingesting that.
Right. It's the same concept with microplastics, right? Like you have a plastic bottle, you're not purposefully drinking microplastics, but it just happens to shed into whatever you drink, right? And so I think that's a good conceptual framing to help people understand as well.
We've also found it in makeups. So they're directly applying PFAS-laden products directly onto their skin. Skin is absorbing that, and that's going right into your bloodstream. So like multiple different ways in your own home that we're finding a lot of these different PFAS products leading to exposure.
And Sebastian, one of the things that's very interesting about PFAS exposure in your home, or maybe even in the workplace, is that it's similar to microplastics, right? Where they decompose and become micro or nanoplastics that you could inhale or ingest. PFAS products in your home are also degrading, right? And that degradation of the product gives rise to household dust and dust even in the workplace. And what we're starting to see in the research literature is that inhalation of dust actually contains PFAS, and people are breathing that in the same way they would be breathing in or ingesting those microplastics. So the research day to day that we see on PFAS does not instill a lot of confidence that things are getting better. In fact, the science is showing that things are more worrisome than not.
Something that I would add is with respect to PFAS in the environment, one large issue is passive receivers who receive PFAS through things like wastewater. And wastewater treatment plants serve as concentrators for PFAS chemicals, which leads also to their use at biosolids for fertilizer. And there are high concentrations of PFAS in fertilizer, and that comes from the concentration through wastewater treatment plants.
That passive receiver concept is a good bridge to where things stand at the national level. And so what is the current status of PFAS regulation at the federal level?
Well, I'm going to just take a policy answer to that, and then we're joined by counsel to answer that question as well to add some color to it. So in general, I think what we're seeing right now is a retreat or retraction in federal protections that had been previously secured with respect to PFAS. And that may be under all the major statutes that we know, air, water, waste. But you're also seeing it with things like TSCA, where chemicals are being brought into or products are being brought into the U.S. or manufactured in the U.S. with higher concentrations of PFAS that are deemed not reportable. They don't have to be disclosed. So we're seeing just in general that the statutes, while they're largely staying the same under congressional direction, that executive agencies are implementing them with less protection and rolling things back in a way that states are now having to deal with.
I would agree with that. I would also point out that the EPA recently rolled back the 6 PFAS compounds listed under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And EPA has indicated they're going to roll back the MCLs for 4 out of the 6. So there will only be PFOA and PFOS that are listed.
The helpful note is that PFAS is actually an umbrella term for thousands of different types of these polyfluorinated compounds. There's PFOA, PFOS, Gen X, tens of thousands of these, but PFAS is just that general umbrella term.
Well, thank you all for providing that outlook of what the current situation is under U.S. federal law. And really important to point out that there is a retreat from regulating at least a bigger chunk of this umbrella, right? There's a narrowing of the definition. So in that case, what tools do states have to regulate PFAS, and are they sufficient?
States have the option to pass their own statutes. Under federal law, we are always required to meet EPA standards. States must be as stringent as the federal standards, but states have the opportunity to be more stringent than federal laws. So states can act on their own and start to regulate some of these laws. I mean, New Mexico, for example, we went to our legislature last year, 2025, and we passed a law that made aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, which is used in firefighting foam, and we dubbed that a hazardous waste in New Mexico. So that's a big tool that, states can certainly use, followed by rulemakings along those lines. And states always have the opportunity to litigate, although that's more of a reactive tool than a proactive tool. But that's always something that a state can do in order to protect themselves.
Yeah, Sebastian, I'm going to add to that as well. You're seeing federal protections rolled back or that retreat from certain types of PFAS being regulated under sort of those core statutes that we do have authorization or primacy for to be more stringent than. That has a lot of collateral impact as well. So going to the legislature and passing something is certainly the purview of a state, and that's a heavy lift for what states can do, but it is a tool in the toolbox. I agree. So I think the other piece that you look at when regulations are rolling back as they have been, like look at TSCA, for example. As higher concentration products containing PFAS are moving into the United States or moving into our communities and showing up in your homes and your businesses, there's still that sort of back end of when you throw that product away or when you rinse it off and it gets into the landfills, it gets into the wastewater treatment systems. We're still having to deal with the health impacts or the environmental impacts of PFAS on the back end. So we've created a scenario where states are going to have more responsibility to protect their communities, and yet the front end of the system is a door left open, as opposed to a door that is rightfully closed or sized for the science of what these chemicals are doing or telling us to do for the health and protection of our families.
Jim, I think you raise an important point that this pullback is in some ways like pushing off the work that states are going to eventually have to do, to put it in simple terms, clean up this mess, right? But New Mexico is one of the states, as you all mentioned, with the firefighting foam that has taken a more proactive approach and has begun to take action on PFAS. So can you walk us through some of what New Mexico has done?
Certainly. So New Mexico has taken a multi-pronged approach to regulating PFAS, both with respect to AFFF as a product under the PFAS Protection Act. So before AFFF is ever discharged, it's now regulated as a product. So anybody that possesses AFFF in the state of New Mexico now has to provide an inventory to NMED every year. So the department knows where AFFF exists in the state. It requires that AFFF only be used in emergency purposes. So a big problem that we were having before is it was used for training purposes. So on a regular basis, it was being discharged, which, for example, at Cannon Air Force Base led in part to the contamination of the Ogallala Aquifer. And finally, the PFAS Protection Act requires AFFF to be cleaned up pursuant to the New Mexico Hazardous Waste Act if it is discharged. On the other side of the equation, House Bill 140, which was passed by the legislature last year, added aqueous film-forming foam containing intentionally added PFAS as a hazardous waste. So it's a listed hazardous waste under the New Mexico Hazardous Waste Act and is subject to those regulations if it is discharged. With respect to consumer products, the PFAS Protection Act is a very comprehensive law, and we recently presented a new rule to the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board. The New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board is an independent board that is administratively attached to NMED, and NMED does not have rulemaking authority on its own. So if we want to pass a new rule or regulation, we have to present that to the Environmental Improvement Board. And we went through that process in February and presented to them a rule that it implements the phase out, the prohibition of the sale of several different products in January 1, 2027. There's another group of products that are going to be prohibited from sale January 1, 2028. And then on January 1, 2032, any consumer product containing intentionally added PFAS that's not otherwise prohibited from sale will be banned in the state. The rule also included a labeling requirement. So starting January 1, 2027, any consumer product containing intentionally added PFAS will now have to bear a label. And that is a first of its kind rule in the sense that the label that's required is an Erlenmeyer flask with the word PFAS inside of it. So it's an icon, if you will. And that's never been done before. So that's something we're really excited about.
Yeah, and why we're excited about that particular piece in New Mexico is, we're a state that as you walk down the street in New Mexico, you're going to hear people speaking Spanish. You're going to see different levels of education or meet people with different levels of education. We have a whole group of individuals who speak Vietnamese. We have people who speak English. It's just like a great place for diversity. And we wanted this icon to be universally recognized, regardless of your education, regardless of your primary language. We did not want a label for something that included PFAS to become an educational barrier for people to know what's in their product. And families all across New Mexico, all across the region who come to New Mexico will see this label on a product, and they can make a choice as to whether their risk tolerance is such that they will bring that into their home or they won't bring that into their home. And what I like to say about this part of the conversation when I talk about labeling is New Mexicans deserve the same honesty and transparency that the manufacturers have when they make their product. They know how to protect their workers. They know what's in their products. They know what they're reporting to shareholders. On that side of the equation, everybody knows what's happening. When it transfers over to the consumer, that product transfers over to the consumer, there isn't that same knowledge. There isn't that same level of honesty and transparency today, but there will be in New Mexico come January of next year. And again, that gives people the ability to be educated and make a choice for themselves.
Maybe to just kind of simplify all that, I mean, we're doing three different things, which is if you have AFFF or firefighting foam, we're listing that as a hazardous waste. And if you're discharging that, you're going to be subject to the Environment Department's regular control. So, we're going right after that, but we're also doing phase outs of consumer products with PFAS in them. And we're requiring labeling of all PFAS products. So, we're going to be able to learn where this stuff is coming from, who's manufacturing it. And we think that's a big piece, just beginning to inventory and understand how it's flowing into our state so that we can understand what to do next. So we're taking big steps now, but I think that these early pieces that we're putting together now will be able to further help research and, hopefully bring us to even better laws, regulations in the future.
That's great. And I'm just really excited to hear that. And I really take to your point about like the accessibility of the label too. I think that's really important. I really like Latino snacks, and a lot of them that are imported now from like Mexico. I mean, this is a different kind of label, but they'll have like sugar label from the health department. And I mean, from conversations I've had, labels like that are like intentionally made and accessible really do influence consumer patterns and shape people's perceptions of the things they're consuming. And I mean, one step toward for PFAS will maybe be finishing that education of what PFAS is, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to start somewhere also. And I think that's what we're really doing is we're beginning that education phase. And I remember, or at least, I look for Red 40 in a product that I'm using because now I know Red 40 isn't as good for it. Well, now we're going to put that PFAS label on that product. And, that's the first step, awareness. And so we think that just forcing that awareness is that first big piece.
And Sebastian, I was going to add, because I feel like you're going to ask me anyway, we also recognize that by New Mexico taking this monumental step forward. We're here in Washington, and even with some of the associations who don't drink our water, don't pay taxes in New Mexico, don't have homes there, they don't vote there. Even with them having an outsized interest in what's happening in New Mexico and maybe opposing some of these requirements, I do agree that there is a degree of a patchwork forming, right, between the states. And we have built into our law and rules reciprocity with other states so that we can actually move forward in a unified way in which, honestly, states coming together is sort of the role of the federal government here, right? To set a national standard in which states could then exceed. But the way the states are now working, because we're on the front line of the issues, I don't have the luxury, and I wouldn't do it anyway, of saying to somebody who's calling me or calling the department, I'm concerned about my water, my child isn't feeling good, or I'm concerned about the ailments from my extended family. We don't have the luxury of saying we'll get back to you. We have to solve those problems in real time. So point being that the federal government has the sort of distance from communities, but their job is to set a national standard, and they're not doing that. So states are banding together and doing that in lieu of federal leadership.
And I would only add that what we see EPA doing in terms of rolling back some of these protections or these regulations, what I hear is they're doing it because, at least what we hear is that there's not enough information on some of these other types of PFAS chemicals. They are saying, well, we need to continue to study it to really fully understand the toxicity of these products. But coming back to our label, what we did is we put, that Erlenmeyer flask, the chemistry flask. We could have used skull and crossbone, but we chose to go with that flask because of a similar reason, right? Because we don't have a full understanding of the tens of thousands of different types of PFAS out there. So it would have possibly been a bit of a stretch or an overstep on our part to put a skull and crossbones on all types of PFAS products where there hasn't been enough of that study, enough of that research done. Our label allows us to take that uniform, neutral approach that says, this has PFAS, and you, the consumer, continue to do some education, as opposed to rolling that back and saying, well, we don't know, so we're not going to do anything. We're saying, well, we don't know, but let's find a way to continue to educate people.
Yeah, certainly. And you did kind of perfectly capture what I wanted to go into next, which was how the approach compared to states and to what EPA is doing.
Let's unpack that question maybe a little bit more. So, as states continue to work on the challenges of PFAS contamination in their communities, and they are working collaboratively with each other, because here's the facts, here's the basics, that if you're sending your child to a camp, and that could be a camp in New Mexico, but it could be a camp anywhere in the country, often times in rural parts where we enjoy the great outdoors, we're using water that's sourced locally from a well, right? And it may not have the ability to be treated in the same way as your public water systems might be able to be treated. We're seeing PFAS in some of those waters. We're seeing PFAS in RV parks where people might park their RVs and enjoy, again, the great outdoors to get away from those urban areas. I don't think New Mexico shares a uniqueness in how it's experiencing PFAS contamination. I think what all states are seeing is that where we look, we tend to find it. And if that's in the east from chemical manufacturing and discharge or air deposition, it's happening. If that's around a military base in your community anywhere in America, where you have 700 plus military bases that have known PFAS problems, that's happening in your community. If you buy consumer products in any state in the country, both the product and the packaging contains PFAS. So we're seeing the same problems. We're seeing that there could be a fit by the federal government to minimize or address those PFAS, but states are having to move forward. And here's the really interesting part that we don't talk about, in my opinion, enough, is that when you see a budget request coming from the president over to Congress, where some of that money is, if not large pots of that money, are being recommended to cut the federal budget, and if any of that cut is transferred over to states, we're seeing a lack of national leadership while we're seeing a reduction in federal funds to states. So who's going to pay for that? That's going to be state legislatures having to figure out how to solve the problem in a patchwork across the country without the regulatory or the financial resources to do so. So I think we as states, and I'm not speaking on behalf of all states, but I think many states are thinking that we have to continue to solve the problems as best as we can until we get either certainty with the federal budget or certainty with the federal regulatory regime, because both of those feel quite uncertain today.
And if I could only add one other comment, I would say that where EPA is backing up in the face of uncertainty, New Mexico is moving forward in the face of uncertainty. We're saying, yes, we know that there is uncertainty, but we need to go find out more. It's going to only remain uncertain. There's only going to continue to be this lack of information if we continue to just back up and go after what we know. New Mexico is taking the exact opposite approach, which is let's go out, research, let's study, let's learn as much as we possibly can and continue to progress the overall knowledge. And with that knowledge, we can continue to make our laws better, more sufficient, and hopefully protect more people.
Thank you, Zach. And yeah, that's a really important point. You know, the fact that there is this lack of information and this need for more information, and the only way to acquire it is through action, right? And that makes me want to move on to discuss some of the litigation that's going on in the space, which is almost a way to do some of the discovery of this information, right? A way to find out a little bit more. I mean, there's a lot of litigation that's going on in this space. You have some regulatory litigation going on where groups are challenging the MCLs that were set by the federal government in one direction or the other. ELI recently published a report going over both the litigation that's going on in the regulatory space, but also from states about some of the industries that are involved with PFAS production. Is New Mexico currently involved in any PFAS related legal actions, and what can you share about those efforts, if so?
Yeah, New Mexico is currently involved in a number of PFAS-related legal actions. We currently have 3 related but different cases going on right now with the federal government. We have a lawsuit currently sitting before the 10th Circuit where the U.S. challenged us or sued us in 2019 over a permit condition. Cannon Air Force Base has a RCRA Hazardous Waste Act permit with New Mexico. And in 2018, New Mexico had included PFAS as a hazardous waste that the U.S. was required to monitor, test for, and clean up. The U.S. decided instead of kind of going along with New Mexico's permit and taking care of those things, they decided instead to sue us. The second action that was filed just right after the U.S. had sued New Mexico had essentially sued them back for the release of PFAS at Cannon Air Force Base, when New Mexico was essentially suing them for the damage caused by that PFAS release. We had alleged numerous CERCLA claims in an effort to recover our costs and damages associated with that release. And the third action that we have is a little bit more recent. New Mexico had sent an inspector to Cannon Air Force Base, and we had asked our inspector to go out there and test for PFAS at the base. And our inspector was denied access and was told it could test for other types of products or hazardous waste, but was specifically barred from testing for PFAS. So we felt we only had one clear path forward, and that was to also litigate that issue with the U.S. So we added a claim. We had originally sued them in state court. U.S. had eventually pulled that case back into the multi-district litigation in South Carolina, where our previous case against the U.S. is currently sitting. And Greg can talk about the third claim that we have against the U.S. right now.
Certainly, Zach. Yeah, so the third lawsuit initiated by Rinsate Release in July of 2024 in their first case, they discharged into a line that had 13 or 14 errors in it, led to a discharge of PFAS rinsate into the soil. Subsequent to that, they denied access to one of the hazardous waste inspectors at the base. And so we filed a motion to compel access to the base.
And Sebastian, I'm so lucky to have such a good general counsel and such good counsel in our department who can follow this, because if that doesn't feel like the longest and most arduous merry-go-round since 2019 that the state of New Mexico has been on with the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense, then I don't know what would. It's frustrating that we're spending all this time in litigation and all these taxpayer dollars to support both defense litigation and our litigation. And in the meantime, like, what's happening? What's happening is the plume around the bases and cannon is continuing to move and migrate. What does that mean? That means that more farmers will be affected, more agricultural products affected, more PFAS in the environment. The greater the cost, the more passive receivers. So the inaction that has been created, again, through federal rollbacks and regulation or defunding states through federal budgets, or even now litigating against states, all puts New Mexico on a track that the health outcomes from these exposures will only grow and be more grave into the future.
Now that we have the impetus for that third state court action is we had sent an inspector to Cannon Air Force Base to go test for PFAS, and they refused entry for NMED's inspector to start to test and study what kind of PFAS might be out there. Once they refused us, what we felt we only had one option, that is to litigate that. So that's what kind of kickstarted that third lawsuit.
And again, I feel like Zach is giving the legal history and I'm giving the pundit side of the house. But it is interesting to think that the federal government here, the Department of Defense, turning away an inspector, we have all the rights that an authorized state has. We have an authorized program under RCRA. We have a Congress has authorized New Mexico Environment Department to do the work that EPA would have done. We have the absolute right to go on base, as we do to go on to any other business that has a RCRA permit, and assure that they're in compliance and that the actions they're taking are actually protective of public health and the environment. So we're not just dealing with PFAS, we're dealing with, do states have rights? That's what we're talking about when we're denied access at a military base under an authorized program. This is not just New Mexico trying to pick a fight. This is the federal government, the federal executive side of the government, fighting against Congress through New Mexico, right? You see what I'm saying? So that to me is a complete departure of what I hear from the executive agencies, that if Congress tells us to do it, we'll do it, but we're not going to do anything beyond that. Well, it's not true. If Congress says that states have the same rights, then states should have the ability to go on base and collect a sample. So it doesn't feel like we're being genuous around both PFAS and the law.
It really goes back to our conversation from August on cooperative federalism, right? And there's two edges to that. I think last time we talked a lot about the funding. There's been a huge funding squeeze on states when it comes to being able to enforce these programs. Then there's also legal questions to these enforcement actions of whether the federal government will let you do them or not, right?
Well, they will, because there is a 10th Amendment, there is federal law, and New Mexico is not going to reinterpret the intent of federal law or the plain English reading of it, even though that's exactly what is happening with the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense. That is something that we're going to be true to what Congress says, even when they're not.
That jurisdictional ping pong that you're describing, cases bouncing between state and federal court, is generally one of the more confusing aspects of environmental litigation for a lot of people, including myself. So I can only imagine what it's like to actually be litigating in it.
It's because nobody really wants to be in the MDL because, like I said, there are thousands of plaintiffs and hundreds of defendants and one judge. So you end up stuck in line a lot of times. So, we're constantly asking to be let out or find different ways to be anywhere else to litigate our case. It's really tough working in that forum. In that case, the judge has appointed what's called the Plaintiff's Executive Committee. And what that committee does, and there's also a defensive executive committee, but they're essentially gatekeepers for what gets presented to the judge. That's how the judge wants it to work. He wants folks to talk to their plaintiffs' committees, and then the plaintiffs' committee works it up to the judge. So we do end up not only stuck in a line, but also stuck behind this committee that kind of has the say as to whether or not this issue gets to move up, this motion can be filed or not. So we're constantly asking this executive committee, can we file this motion? And, we either get a yes or no. If we get a yes, then we can file and then hope we get an answer from the judge. So it's a difficult process. It's a lengthy process, and everybody's trying to find a way out of there if they can get out. But a lot of folks are still stuck like we are.
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, there's a lot of cases going on in the PFAS space, and I'd suggest to our listeners to check out our latest toxics litigation report, which does cover some of those cases that are going on PFAS, but also microplastics and pesticides and other issues. And I did want to ask you, Secretary, our folks here visiting us here in DC from New Mexico, they're on a bit of a PFAS trip. So do you want to tell us more about why you came to DC and what specifically is New Mexico asking from the federal government?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important for states to tell their story and to be visible. And be visible here in DC is really important because this is where the appropriators are. So we spent time with our congressional delegation staff as well as other congressional delegation staff, talking to them a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that New Mexico has before it and why some of them are unique and some are not unique. So again, being on the Hill and being able to explain where we are in litigation, why we are where we are, and what assistance they might be able to provide either us as a state or even some clarity in directing the Department of Defense on how to maybe resolve some issues with the state would be helpful. And that's exactly what we did. We sat down also with a number of executive agencies and had conversations with them about the implementation of certain regulations, both rules and permitting structures, which again, there's some of that relates to PFAS and some of it that are other issues. One of the more interesting conversations we had is we met with representatives from the European Union, and those representatives are very interested in how New Mexico has created a circularity around PFAS, circularity in regulation. So we're both proactive and reactive. They are very interested in looking at whether the labeling requirements that New Mexico put together, meaning that Erlenmeyer flask with the word PFAS in it, could be replicated across European countries. So very excited to hear that there's some traction already underway with how New Mexico's rules might set an international standard. And again, coming back to that point of, I don't think Europeans want anything different than what we want here in New Mexico, which is a little bit more candor, honesty, and transparency around what's in the products we bring home and serve to our children and put on our breakfast tables and wear all day long, etc. So that was an interesting conversation and one that I think is going to be an interesting one to follow. So those are the types of meetings we had here, all worthwhile, all very productive, and hopefully will pay some dividends off into the near future.
And I understand that you're here to meet with the U.S. Air Force. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that meeting?
Absolutely. So our lieutenant governor heads the New Mexico Military Base Planning Commission, so an organization that focuses on the many military installations that New Mexico has within its boundaries. He is flying in to lead a discussion with the U.S. Air Force in which we're all going to participate and basically offer the following to the U.S. Air Force, which is if the U.S. Air Force at Cannon can continue to clean up on base and fund that cleanup, then New Mexico is ready to go, shovel ready to go in cleaning up off base. The only difference is we don't have the funding to conduct the off-base cleanup. We have the access agreements with the farmers to get onto the land. We have contractors ready and waiting with estimates coming in or already in on what the cost will be. So really what we're here to do is if we want to continue to have a productive relationship or cultivate a productive relationship with our military bases and the communities in which they serve, which is an important role in New Mexico, then this might be the fastest way to move forward. An agreement around off-base cleanup funded by the Department of Defense also would lead to a more productive outcome probably than litigation. So it might influence if the parties would then, they could reach agreement for off-base cleanup, New Mexico lead, federal government funding it. It may lead to a better outcome with litigation more in the background than in the foreground, like the way it is now.
We've had years of litigation, and what that has really done is it's soured the working relationship that we've had with the federal government. We're hoping that we're able to meet in person, face to face, work and see the individual across the table and make common cause with, the common goal of the cleanup. We're hoping we can get on the same page and maybe start to turn that relationship towards a more better working relationship. So one of our big goals, I think, today when we meet with the Air Force is to start to build that relationship so that, look, we're people too. We have a common goal. How can we work together to clean up the PFAS boom that the Air Force had released and is, affecting the people out in New Mexico?
And so I wanted to also bring up last time you were here in DC, a big concern that we talked about was not just the federal pullback from a lot of these statutes, but specifically a lot of the federal pullback when it comes to funding the scientific research that allows states to do enforcement actions, but also be proactive in their own legislation and just generally moves the whole country, right, when it comes to being able to take more proactive and informed stances on environmental issues. And so when it comes to PFAS, how is the weakening of federal scientific and research capacity affecting states' ability to act?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's something we're going to see in the short term and long term. So in the short term, as we talk about disposal and destruction of PFAS chemicals, ensuring that once you pull them out of the ground and you go to destroy those chemicals, that we're not shifting that pollution elsewhere into the environment. So if you thermally are breaking them down, then how do you know without that scientific effort behind it that destruction technology is not merely just emitting and redepositing them in a different part of the environment? So that's a real practical example that I've been thinking a lot about. And where would I go to get that scientific research conducted? Right now, there's, I think, very few places in the country that will take PFAS hazardous waste. That includes often places in Texas when you're in New Mexico. So I think states like Texas really also, like New Mexico, should be thinking about what does that decrease in the scientific endeavor around these substances look like. But I think in the long term, there's something more insidious happening, which is that as we start to defund that research, those research efforts, we start to lose that intellectual knowledge, that academic researcher. Why are they incented to work in analytical chemistry and do that research if there's no federal funding for it, if we're not working to that goal? So I think we create an exodus of that scientific field that really just perpetuates a vacuum of a lack of science going into the future as well. So we lose on the technology, we lose on the workforce. And I think that, again, countries around the globe are picking up on that and investing in it. And we're having to rely on studies that are conducted elsewhere versus here to kind of shape what's happening in our own backyards now.
Losing a generation of PFAS scientists in a way, at least
100%. Yeah. And that's a terrible outcome, not only for PFAS, but it also reduces the conversation to non-fact-based conversations, and they become more emotional, more political, and less data-driven, which is really what we need in this space.
So you're all here in DC to have all of these conversations and really lead on this issue. And so I'm curious for our listeners, what should practitioners be watching most closely in the next months when it comes to action on PFAS at the state and federal level?
On the federal level, certainly watch what the EPA is doing. They're a national standard, and knowing what they're doing and how they're reacting towards PFAS will always be a huge factor. But what the federal government does, or what the EPA does regarding PFAS, also a lot of times affects how the federal government and other agencies acts and reacts towards PFAS. So EPA is really setting the standard for the rest of the federal government. So if they're out there saying, we're not concerned with all 10,000, they only have 2 listed, or we're expecting to only have 2 listed, and they're not worried about the rest, then you can expect to see other federal agencies follow a similar path. And accordingly, you're going to hopefully start to see states step up and fill that space, which is a little sad because states like New Mexico don't have as much funding. So where states will want to step up, they may not be able to follow through without proper funding.
I would also add that I think we can anticipate other states stepping up with respect to laws surrounding consumer products containing PFAS. Maine and Minnesota are both leaders in that area as well. And I think that we can anticipate that other states will pass in similar laws.
So again, over the next 12 to 18 months, I think you'll see states also joining back up. So North Carolina, New Jersey, and New Mexico had originally filed a petition to treat certain types of PFAS as hazardous air pollutants. That petition has not been acted on by the US EPA at this point. Those states and maybe others will renew their interest in getting that petition moved forward. Under the reg agenda that EPA publishes, we've been waiting for EPA to make a decision as to whether or not it will list any PFAS chemicals as hazardous waste. That was a petition that New Mexico submitted to EPA in 2022, and the rules were published as a proposal, but not finalized. So we're looking forward to seeing EPA's disposition of those final rules. So under the Clean Air Act and under RCRA, some federal action could be coming that states have been the initiator of those requests.
And another item that folks should be on the lookout for is decisions out of that MDL in South Carolina, the tip of the spear in terms of litigation and soon to be judicial decisions related to AFFF. And you should expect to see similar types of actions and orders with regard to other types of PFAS out there as well. So as that court in the South Carolina continues to work its way through the docket on the AFFF case, we'll start to see precedent be set over the course of that case as well.
And I'm also really curious about what you raised around labeling, right? As these rules take effect, will they actually drive PFAS out of products? And will that change be limited to New Mexico, or are we going to see industry respond in a more uniform way across states? Because that question of whether a patchwork of state policies can produce some sort of de facto standards feels like one of the defining tensions of this moment, not just for PFAS, but across issues like extended producer responsibility too. Now, before we wrap up, I'd love to give you a chance to leave our listeners with some final thoughts.
I wanted to add one last thing, which is that many people who might hear this, even if you're working in the field or not working in the field, and therefore just understanding PFAS for the first time or for the however many time you've heard about this topic, there's a sense that can feel both frustrating and maybe a little bit hopeless that we're going to deal with forever chemicals for far too long. But again, I think there are definite ways in which we can protect ourselves and protect our loved ones. And it's a little bit of education in that space can go a long way to figuring out better choices that will limit your exposure. So we're very optimistic in New Mexico, and I think we will continue to feel that way because the protections are there in the action states are taking. So again, it's ending on a positive note today.
I'll just add that it can be a daunting process getting for a state or an individual to get out there and try something, hopefully either learn more or to protect yourself against some of these PFAS issues, especially when the EPA and the federal government are taking steps back. So it is the states who are kind of having to step forward and step into that gap. And that can be a little bit scary because you're moving on trying to protect your people from a substance that the federal government is taking a step back and essentially saying, you're on your own. So it's a little bit, like I said, a little bit daunting, a little bit scary to be out there on your own, in uncharted territory. This is a new and emerging contaminant where there isn't as much information. But the only way for us to really get more clarity, to learn more, and to be able to make sure that we're protecting people out there is to take that action. And it is to fill that space, especially if the federal government is stepping back out of that space.
It has truly been an honor having the three of you all on. Thank you, Jim, Zach, and Greg, for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sebastian.
What's happening in New Mexico offers a window into how states are navigating PFAS regulation when federal policy is in flux, through legislation, rulemaking, and litigation all at once. Thanks to Secretary Jim Kenney, Zachary Ogaz, and Greg Smithkier for joining us. For more on the PFAS litigation landscape, ELI's Toxic Litigation Report covers active cases across PFAS, microplastics, pesticides, and more. The link can be found in the show notes. And if you found this episode valuable, share it with a colleague and subscribe to People, Places, Planet wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.